With the Dragon's Dogma 2 DLC having been finally revealed, there's obviously been a lot of excitement about what it's adding to the game. As many of us have guessed for a long time, it's adding a new snowy northern region, with an endgame gameplay loop just like we got with the first Dark Arisen. This makes perfect sense as Dragon's Dogma 2 was launched without a good replayable endgame, with Unmirrored World feeling more like an epilogue, and a new snowy region would obviously look unique compared to the climates of Vermund and Vital that we already have. But would a new biome and endgame loop be enough to make Dragon's Dogma 2 live up to its true potential? In my opinion, no, not quite. As the video title suggests, in my opinion, in order for the game to reach its true potential, it needs those things and a base game overhaul. Based on what we know of the DLC so far, and from having carefully looked over the patch notes for both of the title updates, while there's certainly some very welcome changes for the base game, there's still multiple design aspects not mentioned that I think need improved. In truth, I'd actually started making this video back when the anniversary artwork was first shown, and then with editing about 90% done, they went and revealed the DLC, which essentially did this to my original video. And while it blew up my work and sent me back to the production board, it was for a good reason really, because some of the features that I had originally discussed are indeed being improved in a DLC or updates. So that's a good thing for us all, even if it meant I had to spend some extra time putting my thoughts together. So going forward, I'll focus on the areas of the base game that I think need overhauled which haven't been mentioned in the title updates and haven't been shown in the DLC footage so far. But I'll still mention the areas that I thought needed improved, which now have confirmed improvements coming for them. Before we get deeper into this, I just want to be very, very clear about something. Between Dragon's Dogma and Dragon's Dogma 2, I have a silly amount of time put into this franchise, and I've made wildlife videos for them that took a lot of effort to make. So when I bring up what I consider to be Dragon's Dogma 2's weak points, it's not dooming, it's not unfair criticism just for the sake of it, it's because I know in my bones that Dragon's Dogma 2 could have been so much more than what we got. I genuinely believe Dragon's Dogma 2 had the potential to carve out its own place among the bigger names in the upper echelons of RPGs, if the developers had just given the game the backing it needed in order to feel complete. I say this because in many ways, the base game simply feels unfinished. I have no idea if production was actually cut short, or if what we got was really all that they intended for the game. But either way, for us, it doesn't matter. All that matters is that at the end of the day, what we got was the fantastic skeleton of a game, but with very little meat on the bones. For example, it has one of the best character creators in gaming, but they removed layered clothing, reduced equipment slots, and there's not enough armor sets to justify them being so strictly locked behind vocations, so pawns in the Rift frequently end up looking the same. The core combat is fantastic, but there's nowhere near enough enemy variety to make the best of it. You and the pawns can become extremely powerful, but there's no proper endgame or New Game Plus difficulty scaling for it to serve any purpose. It's like this in nearly every aspect of the game. It feels like they just did the minimum, slapped on a ribbon, and declared it complete. So with that splurge of background thoughts out of the way and the stage set, we can now get to the matter at hand. What I think the base game needs in terms of an overhaul to make it feel complete and reach its true potential. I am going to split my thoughts into two sections, with the first being improvements that I think the base game fundamentally needs, and the second section of changes that I'd like to see but are ultimately more niche and down to personal taste, and thus aren't essential. I'm also going to be realistic, as obviously we can all wish a game had this or that, but at the end of the day, time and money are limited, so a production line needs to be drawn somewhere. With that said, I do want you to listen to this with one caveat in mind, and that's that my thoughts have been compiled as if the developer behind the game truly cares and are willing to put in the effort needed to make it as good as they can realistically achieve, instead of just doing the minimum while charging as much as they can for it. And just for clarity, in case it wasn't obvious enough, the point of this video is to focus on ways that I think the base game needs improved to feel complete, so the new DLC region and its endgame loop won't play a big role in this video. So with all that said, let's finally jump into section 1. The first point is one that has been hammered home since release as one of the biggest complaints about Dragon's Dogma 2, but this wouldn't be a complete video without hammering it home just one more time, so do please bear with me. Point number 1 is that the base game areas need better enemy variety. To be blunt, for a AAA premium priced game, there's no real excuse for the enemy variety to be as low as what we got. The enemy selection is very similar in size to the first game's release in 2012 before Dark Arisen, despite Dark Arisen releasing less than 1 year later, being the version of the game that most people played, and was still overall smaller than some other open world titles at the time. But the real problem is that Dragon's Dogma 2 has the low enemy variety of the 2012 release, while also having an open world that's about 4 times the size of the original game's map. As everyone who played the game now knows, this means you end up fighting the same small selection of enemies over and over and over across a huge open world, with fighting monsters being absolutely central to the Dragon's Dogma experience. The low enemy variety that we got simply wasn't good enough. The next point is technically combining multiple improvements that I think the base game needs, but they're closely linked and in turn go hand in hand with the first point about the enemy variety. So issue number 2 is that the enemy spawn points and AI leashing need overhauled. This overhaul is needed to deal with 3 closely related problems found in the base game, one being that the game's spawn points feel too static, 2 being that the creature's AI are too tightly leashed to the spawn points, and 3 being that the spawn points are a bit densely packed in instead of being thoughtfully placed. So I'm going to briefly talk about each of these issues, but I hope you can already see how they're all linked together and impact each other, and shouldn't be individually thought about in a vacuum. So let's first look at the issue of spawns feeling too static. And by this I mean you will frequently encounter the same enemies in the exact same spots over and over. Now I specifically said that they feel static because technically the game does have locations where different creatures can appear. So for example, instead of being goblins, it could maybe be goblins, harpies or wolves. However, this random factor is very limited due to the small enemy roster and other issues I'll get to in a second. So in reality, you still end up frequently fighting the same enemy in the same area. And secondly, once spawned into the world, most enemies stick very close to their original spawn points, only moving away if combat is triggered. In practice, these 2 things combined, spawn points with little or no variation and enemies that don't wander, means that when you set off on an adventure from one of the capitals, that feeling of adventure is hurt by the fact that for many encounters, it's the exact same enemy at the exact same spot along the trails when you take that route. And even when it comes to the spawn points where a few different enemies can show up, due to the lack of AI roaming, you still know that there's going to be a creature in that specific spot, even if you don't know exactly which enemy it will be. And the final spawn point issue is about them feeling a bit dense. I actually don't think it's as bad as some others say, but I do think it's enough to exasperate everything talked about so far, especially the enemy variety problem. With only a small roster of foes and the spawn points being as closely packed into the world as they are, it's inevitable that the player is going to end up fighting the same few creatures over and over. This led to common complaints at launch about the enemy density, with statements such as "I'm tired of fighting goblins every 20 meters" or similarly worded complaints being frequent to see. And while every 20 meters is an exaggeration, it's easy to understand what they really mean. Now obviously the combat is essential to the Dragon's Dogma formula, so we do want there to be a good amount of enemy encounters, but I'd strongly argue that there's a better way of providing those encounters than what we got at release. In my opinion, some of those spawn points do feel a bit thoughtless in their placement, like they were just dropped in for the sake of it, rather than making much logical sense. So in combination with changes for the previous points about more spawn locations allowing different creatures to spawn in, while still making sense for the region of course, and the creature's AI being tweaked to allow them to roam more, the spawn points themselves could then be looked at to see which are actually needed for the best experience. They could even do what the Lords of the Fallen devs did when they overhauled their game's spawn points due to complaints, by simply offering a toggle option to keep the original dense spawn points for those that like it. So to summarise this spawn point section: 1. Increase the use of spawn points with random enemy selection as far as it can go without breaking immersion. 2. Tweak the AI to allow more creatures to wander away from the initial spawn points. And 3. Then overhaul the spawn point locations themselves so they feel more thoughtfully placed. As I said at the start, these changes would go hand in hand with the first point about the game needing better enemy variety, as better enemy variety would then give the developers more options for increasing the random factor of suitable foes at spawn points. The goal of these changes combined is to help create an experience where you never know exactly what to expect when you set off on your next journey. As I mentioned earlier, currently the sense of adventure is being stifled by the fact that you frequently know exactly where to expect enemies at the next bend in the road or over the next hill, and that level of predictability is simply the opposite of what it means to be on an adventure. So by increasing the randomness of which creatures spawn, and by allowing them to roam away from their spawn locations and thus end up in different places or get into fights with other creatures more often, from the player's perspective, this creates a much less predictable experience. You'd no longer know exactly where and which enemy you'd encounter, and it would create a greater feeling of the world being alive, which would help improve the immersion factor. Individually these are relatively small changes, but I strongly believe they'd stack up to create an experience that would be a much better fit for Dragon's Dogma than what we currently have. For this next area of the game needing improved, I was originally going to say that rewards for exploration don't feel particularly rewarding. However, this area has now been somewhat improved in the 3.1 update, and we'll see more improvements when the new dungeons are added to the base game areas with the DLC. So this point is now shorter than originally planned thanks to those updates, but there's still a couple of related issues I want to discuss about the amount of unique weapons and armours that can be found in the base game. The weapons in Dragon's Dogma are essentially reskins that use the same animations and skills, with just their visuals and stats being different. So the selection available does feel rather low, considering more weapons would really just need more art assets, which would then just use all of the existing skills and animation sets. And as for the armour, during the intro section I mentioned that layered clothing was removed in Dragon's Dogma 2, and that combined with being locked to vocations means that there's not much choice for the player and their pawns. However, as modders and PC players found out, there's actually quite a lot of clothing assets in the game that are equipable by the player and pawns that were simply never made available for use. Instead, in the base game they're exclusive to NPCs, but modders found with a bit of work they could make them available for the player to find and equip. So what the devs could do is an official version of this, by making some of these already made assets wearable for the player and pawns, and then spreading them throughout the world as loot to be found. That's it for now about rewards, but in the second section of the video about personal preferences, I'll have more to say on the topic of loot and how we get it. Those that played the first game can probably hazard a guess about which design choice I might discuss. issue number 4 is one that was a common complaint among veterans of the series, and it's that the game has poor pacing. You become overpowered too early. This was a big one for me personally. It was very noticeable on my first blind playthrough, and it just got even more noticeable on subsequent playthroughs, from as early as before level 20 depending on vocation. You can really feel the level of challenge provided quickly nosedive, and it just keeps on getting easier from there. I understand that some newcomers to Dragon's Dogma found the game challenging, but that was mainly because Dragon's Dogma generally does things differently compared to most open world action RPGs, and has unique mechanics that need to be learned, rather than because the game is actually difficult. So we do think that the base game's pacing in terms of challenge needs to be overhauled, right from the beginning all the way to Onward World, so that it doesn't become so easy as quickly as it currently does. To be clear, I'm not saying that it should chase a Souls-esque difficulty level. It's not that kind of game, and it shouldn't try to be. But a better level of challenge is required for the combat to stay engaging, and for getting better gear to feel more important. Once the base game's standard difficulty pacing has been overhauled, that then directly leads into issue number 5 needing fixed. The game needs a hard mode and New Game Plus difficulty scaling. I'm actually very surprised that the hard mode wasn't mentioned in either of the title update patch notes, especially when there's quite a few other changes that will make the game even easier than it currently is. So hopefully it's a surprise addition with the next update, or at least comes with the DLC. Now some of you might be wondering why I didn't just say the game needs a hard mode in point number 4 about raising the challenge level, because that would make the game more difficult, like I suggested it needed to be, right? Well, I personally wouldn't agree with that line of thought, as I think just adding a hard mode would be lazy and not enough. It would be the equivalent of just slapping on a plaster and saying job done. In my opinion, the game fundamentally needs that overhaul of the difficulty pacing as mentioned in point number 4 for a better experience, and then once that's sorted, a hard mode and New Game Plus scaling would both build upon that improvement for those that want an even greater challenge. So that's why this is its own point. The fundamental pacing should be fixed first, and then hard mode and New Game Plus should be added on top of that to satiate players' skill levels and improve replay value. And the final point in this section is related to both exploration and challenge, as it's about the game's dungeons. I had originally planned on pointing out that there's multiple blocked off doorways dotted around the base game, and that they should open up the blocked off doors as higher level dungeons. But it seems that's exactly what they're going to do with the DLC. At the time of recording, it's not 100% confirmed that the 12 new dungeons will use these doors, but it is confirmed that they're in the base game. So I can cut this point short. I just wanted to acknowledge the improvements coming to this area. That's it for section 1. So let's briefly recap the points raised about fundamental improvements that I think the base game needs. 1. Improve the enemy variety. 2. Overhaul the spawn points so that they feel less static, have more thoughtful placement, and tweak the enemy AI so that they can wander around more. 3. Improve the rewards for exploration. 4. Improve the game's pacing so it doesn't become as easy so quickly. 5. Add a hard mode and New Game Plus difficulty scaling. And 6. Open up some of the blocked off doors as high level dungeons. At the time of recording this, we know at least 2 of these areas are getting new improvements, the rewards and new dungeons. But if all 6 of these points were combined in an update, I hope most of you would agree that the Dragon's Dogma 2 base game experience would be much closer to feeling complete, the kind of experience that the game frankly should have had at launch. Now before we move on to the second section, I just want to cover a couple of things, because I know some of you will be wondering why I didn't mention other valid issues that the community had with Dragon's Dogma 2, such as the main story feeling weirdly rushed once you hit Batal, or there not being many vocations or vocation skills to choose from. So for the story, while I do agree that it doesn't feel complete, it's as if there's a middle chunk missing and the beginning and end were just mushed together to form the story we got. But with that said, I think we can all agree that Dragon's Dogma is first and foremost a gameplay game. Yes, it would be nice to have a story that feels more fleshed out, but ultimately, the combat and exploration is what Dragon's Dogma is all about. And if you remember back to the first section intro when I mentioned wanting to think realistically, well, we on this side of the fence simply don't know what was actually planned for the main story. Maybe they did have character dialogue and story scenes nearly done that were just never implemented, or maybe it would actually be a lot of work to finish the job with new dialogue and animated sequences needed to be made, and expecting that, along with everything else, is likely an unrealistic expectation. And as for needing more vocations and vocation skills, I do agree with that general thought, but we now know that at least new skills are coming with the DLC, and I don't mind if they end up being rewards found in the new region, so it's simply outside of this video's focus. And I'd also like to briefly cover the topic of mods, because I know that some of you will be thinking of saying that there's mods that would help with parts of what I've been talking about in this video. And they do. Modders have went to great efforts to try and improve the base game in ways that are at least in the same direction as my own ideas, which is comforting, as at least I know I'm not alone in my thoughts for how the game needs improved. But with that said, I'm not really a fan of this reliance on mods, because in a way, it lets the actual developers off the hook. We shouldn't need modders in order to make a game feel complete. That's the developer's job. In my opinion, modding should be about expanding upon an experience that already felt complete without modding it, or it should be about adding more personal preference options for players to tweak things to their liking. And remember, about half the player base is on console with no access to mods at all. So yes, it's great that modders have done a lot to help fix Dragon's Dogma 2's weak areas, but frankly, they shouldn't need fixing. These bigger weak points should have been covered by the developers before launch, or at the very least, they should have been addressed in free post-launch updates. Now we can move on to section 2, and as I said earlier, these thoughts aren't essential and are more about my personal preferences for what I would have liked to see in Dragon's Dogma 2. So if you don't agree with what I say here, that's perfectly fine. That's why what I'm about to say is here and not in the first section, because I know everyone's got their own preferences and niche gameplay desires for what Dragon's Dogma could be. So let's jump in. Back in section 1, while talking about rewards for exploration, I mentioned I'd have more to say about loot in the video later on, and that time has come. This one will be divisive, and not just for Dragon's Dogma 2, because it's about something that's been dividing gamers for decades and will probably continue to do so until the end of time. Yep, this point is about random loot versus static loot. In Dragon's Dogma, most chests had a loot list with a random factor deciding what you'd get, and then they'd respawn after a certain amount of time has passed. While chests in Dragon's Dogma 2 have fixed rewards and don't respawn during the current playthrough. There's a fairly even divide among the community about which is better, and both certainly have their objective pros and cons. But for a game like Dragon's Dogma, I'm going to have to come down on the side of thinking that they should overhaul chests to include both random and static loot. Overall, I just don't think that the purely static chests that we currently have is a good fit for the game, as it reduces the desire to return to places and, much like the static spawns, creates a sense of predictability that I don't think suits the Dragon's Dogma formula. Now, I completely understand why some prefer static loot, as it means if you only care about getting certain items, then obviously static loot chests are rather helpful in that regard. But ultimately, overall, I think the benefits of random loot lists, such as adding a sense of unknown to adventures and increasing replay variation, outweighs the benefits of purely static loot in a game like Dragon's Dogma. Also note that I said chests should be a mix of random and static, not just random. I think for quests or special items, some high level gear, or for gear that makes specific logical sense for an area's chest, it's perfectly fine for these to be static rewards. However, these would be a minority, with random loot lists making up the majority of chest rewards. And of course, the random loot lists should still be thoughtful so that they make sense for the area, so it feels natural and immersion isn't broken. The next two suggestions are both related to the general lack of human life or things happening outside of the game's settlements. The first of these suggestions is to add more travellers and guards to the open world. In Dragon's Dogma 2, beyond the cities and villages, other than ox carts that spawn at certain points if the player is nearby, random ponds, a few merchants who stand around, and a few fake arisen parties that stand around or move between 2 points, there's nothing but creatures and bandits to be found in the open world. This is in contrast to the first game that had NPCs and guards who would naturally travel by foot along the roads between settlements, which added a sense of life to the world. Now, a couple of obvious excuses for the lack of these features is that in the game's setting it's dangerous to go by foot, and the world of Dragon's Dogma 2 is much bigger, so travelling by ox cart makes sense, right? Both of these arguments do make sense, but given that the game has story quests with squads of guards being out on foot, and there's random events for saving or escorting NPCs who were out travelling by foot, to me it just feels lazy that they didn't have any of these things happening naturally, when it would have been an easy thing for them to add. So this is something that I'd like to see added to the game, and there's no need for it to be complex. It just needs a few different NPC types travelling the open world, and they could even be random generics, so there's no issue if they die off. A few templates for these NPCs could be townsfolk braving the roads, either on their own or in a pair. They'd simply attempt to travel between settlements. Guards patrolling the roads between settlements by foot in groups of 4. Or hunters who leave settlements alone or in pairs to hunt creatures such as deer. As I said, these things don't need to be complex, just simple NPC types doing their own thing in the open world. When you combine this with changes mentioned earlier, such as more random enemy spawns and letting creatures roam around more, then these basic additions would work together to create a world that feels more alive and dynamic, which in turn would improve the player's feeling of being on an adventure. And if any of that sounds frivolous or lofty, just remember that the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion had NPCs travelling between towns, guards patrolling the roads, and foresters hunting animals around settlements back in 2006. So if Big Todd could do that back then, I don't see why the Dragon's Dogma 2 devs couldn't do it today. I originally said that there were 2 suggestions related to improving the open world's general lack of life. So the second part is that the game needs more varied random events. As it stands, the game has an extremely small set of random events you can encounter, including an NPC being attacked, an NPC asking for an escort, scripted raids on ox carts, camps and settlements, and that's about it. Each of these has a very small number of variants, so it might be a different creature type attacking, but even including the variants, it's still very limited. It's another prime example of the devs just doing the minimum in order to make a feature technically functional, and declaring it done instead of doing more to make it feel robust. To use the Elder Scrolls again as a comparison, Skyrim had a much more robust random encounter system, and it released before the first Dragon's Dogma. So simply put, it would be nice to have more variation in the random events that the player can experience while travelling the world, instead of being essentially just save this NPC or escort this NPC. Again, this is something that wouldn't have been difficult for the devs to do, so it's hard to excuse Dragon's Dogma 2 releasing with such a small selection of random events in a game where exploration is such a big part of the gameplay. Suggestion number 4 is a simple one. It's that I think the game could do with an infinite quest system. I'm sure you'll know what I mean. Just basic, randomly generated quests, like being tasked to defeat a creature or clear a cave, and then return for an award. These quests could be picked up at jobs boards, the guild, or from specific NPCs, and there's no need for them to be complex. They just need to be a varied selection of straightforward quests to help give the players some additional reasoning behind their adventures in the open world. And finally, to wrap up section 2, I was originally going to say that there's a few small changes and quality of life improvements I'd like to see. However, I am pleased to say that the 2 title updates are doing a great job in this area, with toggle options for the wormfire effect and for stopping unhired pawns from approaching, more save slots, and multiple other quality of life improvements. With that said, there's still one rather specific quality of life improvement I'd like to see that isn't mentioned in either of the patch notes, so I'll quickly mention it here. I'd like to see an option to make dialogue continue without prompts. In the base game, NPCs will frequently stop talking after each sentence until the player manually continues the conversation, which is a little immersion breaking and tedious, especially on repeat playthroughs. Some games add a simple toggle option so the player can choose to have dialogue continue unprompted, like we see here in Dynasty Wars Origins, and I'd like to see that feature added to Dragon's Dogma 2. That's it for section 2. So let's just recap these suggestions, which would be nice to have, but aren't essential. 1. Overhaul chests to include both random and static loot. 2. Add more travellers and guards to the open world. 3. The game needs more varied random events. 4. Add an infinite quest system. And 5. A few small changes and quality of life improvements I'd like to see, including an option for dialogue to continue without prompts. And I'm finally done. I could honestly go on, but some of you probably fell asleep a while ago, so let's wrap this up. Now, do I actually expect all of these base game changes to be in the DLC or free updates? No, not at all. This was really just a selection of the game's areas that I'd personally like to improve if I was in charge, but obviously that's not the case. Beyond the improvements that we already know are coming in the DLC and updates, a hard mode is really the only additional one that I'm actually expecting to see in the future. I would of course love to see more of the base game improvements that I've talked about, but my expectations of anything more beyond a hard mode are fairly low, so anything more will feel like a bonus. So that's it from me. I hope I was able to explain my thinking with clarity and good reasoning, so that it didn't just sound like the mad ramblings of a former Arisen. At the time of recording this, we're just a few months from release, a blink of the eye for any Dragon's Dogma fan. So now we will just have to wait and see if the expansion raises any other secrets from the brine and extends the current cycle we all find ourselves in. Thanks for watching.